Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the 192nd session of the online Optom Learning Series, OOLS. And before we begin the session, I would like to take this opportunity to wish everyone a very happy new year because this is the first time we are meeting on the OOLS platform in the new year 2023. And for today's session and to begin the new year, we have with us Reena Durai. Reena has received her bachelor's degree of optometry from the Sri Ramachandra Medical College, Chennai, and she went ahead to did his post graduation from the Manipal University College of Allied Health Sciences in India as well. She's currently working in the Vision Psychophysics Laboratory, Brian Holden Institute of Optometry and Vision Science at LV Prasad Eye Institute as an assistant optometrist. And with her research interests, she has also started to pursue her PhD in collaboration with LV Prasad and City University, London. Her areas of interest are all nearby the topic which she's going to talk to us today: binocular vision, temporal vision, and things like that, as well as binocular summation of flicker sensitivity. And all of this work, what she does in her research lab, has been well published as well as presented in national and international conferences. So welcome, Reena, onto the platform. And without wasting time, let me just leave the screen time to you.
Thank you so much, Fakhruddin, for the kind introduction. A very good evening to everyone who are attending this lecture. Again, Happy New Year, Happy Healthy New Year to everybody who are there. So, as Fakhruddin said, that my PhD work, revolves around temporal domain. I'm going to give a gist of what I'm doing and what is known and what is still not known, throughout this process. So as the title itself says, why two eyes, a temporal domain perspective, I'm going to drift around both, spatial and temporal domain. So for the next 30 to 45 minutes, I'm going to talk more about binocularity and binocular summation in the temporal domain. So a quick outline of, So again, I don't have any commercial relationships to disclose. Again, the outline for today's talk for the next 40 minutes is, again, as I said, a brief introduction of both spatial and temporal contrast sensitivity and, what we presently know in the temporal contrast sensitivity function or the domain, binocularity as a function in the temporal domain, and facts that needed more evidence. That's where my PhD kicks in. So I'm going to talk and show a few results that we had found, and also end showing what is the evidence that we presently have to answer the unanswered research questions that are there. So this is one of my favorite slides. I would say I've used this in a couple of other presentations as well. So the question of why humans, sort of evolved into, creatures that have two eyes is a very interesting question. And probably, this question has been asked numerous times, numerous centuries ago, these questions have been answered. Nevertheless, this sort of prevails to be, the most fascinating questions of all times. And as a researcher, you would wonder, what are the advantages that humans would infer from two eyes? And those are the advantages that I'm going to, sort of point out in the temporal domain. So going into a more scientific perspective of this, over here you see, a picture of the Charminar, the busy roads of Charminar. This is in Hyderabad. I am living in Hyderabad at present. And this picture has multiple cues, starting from, the spatial frequencies, a very low spatial frequency, a very high spatial frequency targets, and the rich chromaticity background that you see. You can also perceive depth from this 2D picture. So these are the different visual cues that are there for our visual system to infer and, predict what we exactly see. But over here, what my focus would be is not on the static targets, but on the temporally, time-changing targets, right? So quickly, I'm going to take this to a more, experimental perspective. So over here in this slide, this gentleman over here is F.W. Campbell. He has done several, or he has given several seminal outputs for the contrast sensitivity that we know at present several years back. So he has contributed majorly on the basic understanding of contrast sensitivity, and that's over here. So I would take a little more time, explaining what is a spatial contrast sensitivity function, because once we understand what is spatial contrast, it's very easy for us to know what is temporal contrast, because they are almost the same, they almost have the same features. So I'll start off explaining what is spatial contrast first. As I showed you the picture before, the Charminar, I said there are different spatial frequencies, a very low spatial frequency target as well as a very high spatial frequency target. So the X over here, the X axis and the Y axis over here, if you may see, this is the spatial frequency and the units is cycles per degree. And this is the y-axis is the sensitivity of the observer, right? Now, it may look a little complex to, sort of infer what it is, but it's very easy. So as the spatial frequency, as I said, it's cycles per degree, which is, as the name itself says, how many cycles can a degree hold? So one cycle is a black and white, bar that you see over here, black and white patch that you see. So this is one cycle, right? So for a degree, how many cycles we could, fit in gives you the spatial frequency. So this is 1 cycles per degree. If I'm combining all this in 1 degree, it can be 1, 2, 3, and 4 cycles per degree, right? That's the spatial frequency. So sensitivity is something, how sensitive is the observer for a given target. Now that target can be a very low spatial frequency or a very high spatial frequency, right? This sort of explains what is the capability of our visual system to resolve or discriminate the target that we see there, right? So this is a very low spatial frequency if you're following my cursor. And as you increase over here are the higher spatial frequencies, right? And the sensitivity curve, if you see, say if I am the observer and this is my, contrast sensitivity function, for a very low spatial frequency, my sensitivity is very poor or moderate. And as I increase the spatial frequency, my sensitivity increases, right? This is the peak of the sensitivity. And slowly again, my sensitivity falls off, right? In other words, what you could also say is that for a given observer, the area below this curve is the visible area. That is, below this, I can see or perceive everything in front of me. But if the contrast is beyond this, that is something that is invisible, right? So the other critical factor that should also be sort of understood is, the contrast that is being modulated in these functions, okay? So sensitivity means for a given spatial frequency, how much contrast or what is the minimum contrast for me to perceive the target, right? So this is the minimum contrast that I require to perceive the target at this particular spatial frequency. And as the spatial frequency increases, the contrast required also increases, right? That's the inference of this particular contrast sensitivity function, okay? So moving on to such similar inferences for the temporal domain, okay? So what if I change the target over time? Okay, what will happen if the target changes over time? Now, if you see over here, you see multiple squares over here. This is a 0 temporal frequency target. And these subsequent squares means that I'm increasing the temporal frequency, and you would see what would happen right now. So you see what happens, right? So this is the 0 temporal frequency, which means there is no change in the target. It's a static target because it's 0. It doesn't have any frequency to it. So here frequency means hertz. That's something that changes per second. So cycles per degree is spatial and cycles per second is temporal frequency, right? Now, as I increase the temporal frequency, you see the magnitude of that flickering is tremendously changing over here. So over here, it starts from black and then goes to white and then here black, white, and then again it increases to black, white, and here it's black, white, black, white. So this is the flickering target for a high temporal frequency, and this would be the target that we show for the subject to see how sensitive are they in picking up a flickering target and differentiating this target to a static target, right? So to dive into more details of this temporal contrast sensitivity function, like Campbell, the human temporal contrast sensitivity had been, given more weightage due to the work that was done before by Kelly and Birbeck. So these are the people who have worked extensively, in giving the basic idea of what is temporal contrast sensitivity, like the spatial that we have. So again, this becomes a very critical graph for us to understand what is temporal contrast sensitivity function. So over here, the x-axis shows the temporal frequency. So I'm going to, from now on, I would be comparing the spatial as well as the temporal contrast sensitivity for our own understanding. So in that case, it will be very easy for us to interpret the findings as well. So over here, you see the x-axis having a temporal frequency range. Units are hertz, or you can also call it as cycles per second. And y-axis shows the contrast sensitivity. Okay, how sensitive is the subject in perceiving the given temporal frequency. So for a second, if you ignore all the other curves over here, because these are with different luminances, I'm not going to go into details of that. But if you focus on the one which is highlighted over here, this is very similar to what we saw in the spatial contrast sensitivity function, right? So the sensitivity for a very low temporal frequency is mild to moderate. I mean, they are able to see, and they're a little sensitive to that specific frequency. And as the temporal frequency increases, there is a peak in that function where this is the highest sensitivity for the temporal frequency of the range. And as the temporal frequency increases, again, you see the plummet in that function where it significantly drops from where it began. So any function, any contrast sensitivity function, if you see, there is a peak in that function and there is a cutoff in that function. I'm just going to quickly go to the spatial over here. So the peak of the spatial contrast sensitivity is around 6 to 8 cycles per degree. Okay, that's the peak, or that's the highest sensitivity for a given observer, right? And this is the cutoff for that function, right? So the cutoff is the minimum, or in other words, the acuity, the maximum acuity that the humans could attain is the cutoff of the function. Now, quickly going to the temporal and the same points over here, the peak is the maximum sensitivity that you have for a given temporal frequency, and that ranges anywhere between around 10 to 15 cycles per second. And the cutoff over here, like your visual acuity cutoff, here we call it as a critical flicker fusion frequency, or the CFF. And that's about 50 to 60 cycles per second, or hertz, right? So there is a peak in the function and there is a cutoff in the function for both spatial and temporal contrast sensitivity function. And each of this range will be different. It won't be the same, right? So the range is very important because that's the normal peak, that is expected peak for a human observer. Okay. So there are quite a few overlap that is there. As I mentioned before, I'll be comparing both these functions together, and the overlap, what are the overlaps that are there for spatial and temporal contrast sensitivity function is something that we need to understand to know, what are the parameters that remain the same in these functions, right? So there are, just a second. Yeah. So starting off from, the overlap, what I'm talking about is factors that could influence these functions, both in the spatial and temporal, right? For instance, taking luminance as a factor. Now, if I vary luminance, how is the sensitivity function going to change, right? In both the domain. I'm going to show a few examples from the previous literature so that, we make correct judgments of what is going on in the spatial and the temporal domain. So over here, luminance as a factor, or, the light levels, right? So I'll show two graphs. One is for spatial and one is for temporal. The same way for all the parameters, I would subsequently compare the graphs for both spatial and temporal and let you know what exactly is the difference between the both. So when it comes to luminance as a factor, here the x-axis, so in all the graphs, the x-axis would be spatial frequency, that is cycles per degree, and the y-axis will be the sensitivity. And the other graph that I would be showing in the right-hand side is the x-axis having temporal frequency or hertz, and the y-axis will be the contrast sensitivity, right? So the x-axis over here shows you a spatial frequency starting from a very minimal spatial frequency to a high spatial frequency. This is in log axis. And the y-axis is how sensitive is the observer in seeing that target, as we saw before, right? And the different colors that you see over here are the different light levels that were used in the target. So a target can have a very low luminance and the same target can have a very high luminance as well. So the high luminance that was used in the experiment was 1000 candela per meter squared. Candela per meter squared is a unit for luminance. And the minimum that was used was 0.1 candela per meter squared. So you can say that it is from a photopic level to a mesopic level, right? And that way it's more clearer for us. So the photopic level, I would say from 1000 to 10 over here starts from this red curve, green curve, and the pink curve. And the mesopic is this blue and the yellow, right? Now we see a very clear change, the vertically displaced curves that you see over here for different luminances. Having the photopic being the superior one, the sensitivity is high for a photopic target, whereas the mesopic target sort of comes down, the sensitivity level decreases, which infers that you need more luminance for us to have a good sensitivity in the spatial domain for a given spatial frequency, right? More or less this function, all the curves that is here shows the same contrast sensitivity function that we saw before, right? Only that the luminance would vertically displace the graph, saying that the sensitivity would drop if we are going to a mesopic level, regardless of what the spatial frequency is. Now that is for the spatial frequency. Now, what about the temporal frequency? Now, this looks a little busy, but it's very easy once you follow the legends. Again, the x-axis, as I said, it would be the temporal frequency, and the y-axis, keep it as a sensitivity, okay? It's threshold modulation ratio, but you can infer this as a sensitivity function, okay? So the different legends over here, again, different color marker shows you the different retinal luminance or the luminance of the target that has been used. Over here, the units are denoted as trolins, and over here, candela per meter squared. This can be easily converted to trolins. Trolins are nothing but the unit that is used to measure the retinal illuminance. The amount of light that is reaching the retina is trolins, and it is essentially calculated using the stimulus intensity as well as your pupil size. So both are the same. One denotes the retinal level attraction of light, and the other denotes the stimulus intensity itself. Okay. So if we focus over here, the 9300 trolins being the highest light level and 0.06 trolins is the very lowest light level, you could see a significant difference from this black markers as well as the bright blue markers over here, right? So again, for a very high retinal illuminance, the sensitivity of the temporal function is pretty high, whereas as we reduce the luminance or the retinal luminance in trolins, the sensitivity drops down significantly. This shows that luminance as a factor plays a vital role. When you have a very high luminance, whatever your temporal frequency is, it is going to show a significant change when you compare that to a very low luminance target, right? So luminance is the first factor, and the overlap over here is both the functions show similar sort of an output, okay? Moving on to the next factor, chromaticity. Now, luminance is something that, the brightness of the target. Chromaticity, what I mean is what color of the target you're using, right? It can be a achromatic target without any color, or a chromatic target with any given color, red, green, blue, yellow. Now, how is that going to change the function is something that, we want to know. So over here, again, the first graph would show the spatial frequency function to a different target. So here it is nicely seen that the luminance over here means a achromatic target without any color, just a white light. With the white light target, the sensitivity is more or less similar to what we saw previously. But if you see the chromatic targets, a yellow, blue, and red, green target, there is a complete change in the function, right? So a yellow, blue, and a red, green target do not follow the contrast sensitivity function of a luminance target. It is very the visual system is sort of very sensitive to the change in the color of the target. So once you change to red and green, compared to the achromatic, your sensitivity is very poor for a red and green target as well as yellow blue target compared to a regular achromatic target. Now, this is in spatial domain. Seeing the same in the temporal domain, but over here they're not using yellow blue, we are using only red green target. Again, similar drop in the sensitivity compared to the luminance target. Again, this is temporal frequency, this is spatial, but we see a very nice overlap of these functions that we see with different chromaticity that was used, right? Quickly moving on to the eccentricity. So eccentricity is, say I'm showing a target, say your visual acuity. If you measure your visual acuity at the center and you measure the same visual acuity from the periphery, right? So at the center, I'm asking the subject to read the target, and I'm asking the subject to keep the eye gaze fixed at the center and moving the chart to the periphery. Now, will that change the resolution capability of the visual system? It will definitely do. And that's exactly what we also wanted to check in the spatial and the temporal contrast sensitivity function. If you see again, the x-axis shows the spatial frequency cycles per degree. There are two graphs over here. The upper panel shows 0 degree in the sense it is measured at the fovea from the center. And the other one is the extreme 32 degree, that is from the eccentricity. From fovea, 32 degree apart, how are we perceiving the target, right? This is the sensitivity. Now, the different over here, the filled squares and the empty squares denotes their binocular monocular performance. We can ignore that for a second. If you see the trends of these functions, right, both binocular and monocular, again, this function sort of looks like what we saw before, but this flatness that is there is something little different from the spatial contrast sensitivity function. As we increase the spatial frequency, the sensitivity has again a peak, but the cutoff is elongated to 16 cycles per degree for the center. And if you see the periphery, there is absolutely no measurements, right? All it means is that for a given spatial frequency, when you move that target to the periphery, we are no more sensitive for that target. At the center, you are very sensitive. You are able to measure all the spatial frequency. But if I move the same target to the periphery, I am no more sensitive. I'm very insensitive to that particular target, right? So that's exactly what is happening over here. Now, if you ask what happens to the temporal frequency, again over here, the x-axis, the temporal frequency in hertz, and you could see a very nice trend similar to the spatial frequency at fovea, right? 0 degree, there is a similar trend that is shown for all the range of temporal frequency that has been tested. But notice the change that is happening at 32 degree. You see the y-axis over here and the y-axis over there. The peak is above 1.5, right? The peak sensitivity for the temporal frequency a bit higher at the center. But there is a vertical drop in that peak when it comes to 32 degree, which means, again, we are sort of insensitive when we go to the periphery, right? So always the foveal measurement shows a very good sensitivity, both in spatial and temporal domain. But when we move to the periphery, 30 degree and above, say 40 degree, our visual system becomes very insensitive to handle the, that particular stimulus for a given spatial frequency or the temporal frequency, right? Now, the last one is age. Age is a factor. Will that show any difference in both these spatial and temporal contrast sensitivity function? Absolutely, yes. Because again, this is a similar graph. Over here, I'm directly focusing this function for the adults that we saw before. And over here is the data for a 1 month old infant and a 3 day old infant, right? So if you see, naturally a visual system is a system that develops slower, and when you compare a 3 day old and a 1 month old infants, their visual system is not set there to process the spatial frequencies yet, right? So as an adult, I have the capability to resolve up to 30 to 40 cycles per degree, but a 1 month old or a 3 day old infant do not have that capability, and that's why the visual acuity of 1 month old is very, very poor than compared to a adolescent or a younger children, right? The same applies to the temporal frequency. Again, over here, we see the same overlap for the adults, similar trend, and a 3 months old versus a 1.5 month old data that you see, again, they are significantly lower in sensitivity compared to the adults data, right? So these are the overlap. The reason why I wanted to dig in deep about the parameters that overlap in both spatial and temporal contrast sensitivity function is just to understand that these factors play a major role. If any of us are planning to conduct an experiment showing a specific target, these factors should be ruled in and check whether that could affect the functions that we measure or not, be it both spatial and temporal, right? So I'm going to move on to the viewing condition. This is the crux of the talk today. So we saw all the stimulus-oriented characteristics or the parameters except age that has an overlap and that has a potential to vary the functions. But now I'm going to move on to the viewing condition, right? So viewing condition, we have two viewing conditions for any visual function. Say even visual acuity, for instance, you measure the monocular acuity, and then in some cases, especially in the low vision assessment for subjects, we measure their binocular acuity as well, right? So how good are they performing monocularly, and how good are they performing binocularly, right? So what is the difference in terms of viewing condition for all the parameters that we had discussed in the spatial and temporal domain? So this particular graph that is here is again from Campbell and Green. They have proposed the difference between monocular and binocular visual acuity, visual contrast sensitivity in 1965. And what they found was this. So the markers, the round filled markers, circular filled markers are the binocular performance, the top one. And the monocular, both right eye separately and left eye separately, are something that is overlapping over here, right? These are the monocular performance. And what you see over here is, and this is the sensitivity and spatial frequency again. So the sensitivity of both eye, right, binocular viewing condition over here seems to be better than the monocular condition, right? So when I'm measuring the contrast sensitivity, all the measurements that we spoke before can be monocular and binocular, right? What Campbell and Green came up with is that binocularly, when you measure a contrast sensitivity, the performance of that subject is better by a quantity compared to the monocular performance. Now that quantity is something that is over here, and I would talk more in detail in the upcoming slides. But what we want to know is binocular performance is far better than the monocular performance. And this is something that is established in the spatial domain. And temporal domain to an extent also has these data in a couple of papers where with different flicker frequency, or otherwise the temporal frequency in hertz, do show a binocular improvement in the sensitivity compared to the monocular improvement. Sometimes they do overlap for different temporal frequencies, but if you see these data points, at least from 1 to 10 hertz, there is a binocular advantage that one would infer than the monocular performance, right? So let's park this idea in the mind that binocular performance is better than the monocular performance. Now, I want to quickly let you know that there is a quantification for this binocular advantage. So when we say binocularly our contrast sensitivity is better, the first question is how how much is better, how much it is better than the monocular acuity or monocular contrast sensitivity. We need to have that quantification to understand, okay, this is the cutoff for me to say that binocularly I'm improving, or this is the number that is used to say, okay, binocularly there is no improvement or there is an improvement, right? So that quantification comes in the name of binocular summation ratio, right? As the name itself says, it's a summation ratio that measures the inputs from two eyes. How well are we averaging or summating the information from two eyes? And the ratio of that is the quantification that we have up till today, okay? So the way we calculate the binocular summation ratio is using the monocular threshold versus the binocular threshold, right? It's a ratio, it doesn't have a unit to it, but we use the monocular input, one of the monocular input, I'll tell you which one of the monocular input, and compare it to the binocular input, and we have the ratio. Now, for example, say monocular threshold, right? Threshold is nothing but your sensitivity. 1 by threshold gives your sensitivity. Now, monocular threshold, say I have 15%. That's the threshold for my right eye. And I have 15% for the left eye. Both thresholds are the same, okay? And binocularly, say I have 10%. Now, the ratio is calculated using 15% from the monocular threshold divided by 10% of the binocular threshold. This ratio would be greater than 1 because your binocular threshold is better than the monocular threshold, right? So that's how we calculate the summation ratio. I'm going to tell you what would be the possible outcomes from these. Number one is when you calculate the ratio, usually the ratio tends to be within the range of 1 to 2, or it can be more than 2 as well, but the inference over here is more revolving around 1 and close to 2, right? So if the ratio that we calculate for any visual functions is equal to 1, right? Now, say for an example, just for an easy understanding, your right eye input, your left eye input. Now, both are binocularly, when both are performing, there is no change. Okay, both right eye and left eye performs independently. And when you combine these two eyes, there is no change. That is equal to 1, which means binocularly, you're not performing any better. It's still the same. Okay, that's number one. Number two is if the ratio, summation ratio is greater than 1, what happens then? So again, right eye you have, and then comes your left eye. Now, this intersection that you see over here with two right eye and the left eye is your binocular performance. So the region over here is something we call it as an advantage, right? When you combine your right eye signal with the left eye signal, binocularly, you're performing way better, right? So if the ratio is greater than 1, it means you're binocularly far better than the monocular inputs, okay? The last one is less than 1. Okay, we saw what is equal to 1, greater than 1, and what about less than 1? Again, you have your left eye and the right eye, okay? Both combine, but there is a decrease in the binocular performance. Both right eye and left eye, when they combine together, when we measure the ratio, binocularly, their functions are way too poor than their monocular performance itself. So that indicates that binocularly, we don't have any advantage. We are performing even poorer than the monocular performance. Okay. So equal to 1, there is no change. Greater than 1, binocularly, we are far better. Less than 1, we are not better binocularly. We are better off having a right eye, left eye independently. That's the binocular summation ratio inference. Okay. So what we know at present with respect to the summation ratio, if you see over here, the highlighted ones, as I said, remember the inferences that we had. What is 1? What is greater than 1? And if it is even beyond that, what is the ratio and how do we interpret? And this is, just a second. Sorry. Yeah, so this is binocular summation in different units, but I've highlighted the inferences that we had in the previous slides. So this is one, right? And these are the different studies that have included both spatial and temporal domain. And they have assessed what is the advantage of, two eyes or summation ratio. Where does the summation ratio apply and how much is the range of summation ratios that are there from the previous studies? And if you see over here, these are the 65 studies that have been included. All these studies show a vast range of these ratios, right? And all these subjects are normal subjects, visually normal. They do not have any ocular pathology or any other NSBVA conditions. They're just normal. And with all these normal human observers, there is quite a bit of a range with variation that we notice in the summation ratio, right? So in general, a normal, visually normal subject, if we measure their binocular function, why would there be a variation? What could be the reason that could cause the variation in the binocular performance, right? That's something that we wanted to understand more. So in general, what we know in terms of summation ratios, that summation ratios are greater than 1 in the temporal domain as well in few of the studies over here, similar to the spatial domain. However, the quantification has a range, as I mentioned before. We wanted to intervene to understand what are the factors that could vastly change the range of summation ratios, right? So in order to do that, the factors that has been studied in our lab is primarily targeting two things. One is the monocular input, because when it comes to binocular summation, as I said, you have the right eye signal and you have the left eye signal. And the importance of this monocular input the role of this monocular input plays a vital role when summing or averaging the information. So monocular input in terms of, target size, luminance has been studied. I'll go into the details of this in a couple of minutes. And then the second part is the interocular difference. So I said right eye, left eye works independently, but what if, as I gave an example of, 15% threshold in right eye and 15% threshold in the left eye, that seems to be impossible, because both the eyes show different sensitivity. When we measure monocularly any visual function, our right eye and left eye cannot be equal. It cannot have equal sensitivity or threshold for all the visual functions. There will be some sort of inbuilt variation or noise that could occur that causes these interocular differences, and we did factor in that and studied that as well. So I'm going to quickly go into the monocular input as well as the intraocular differences that are there. So what we did here was, as I mentioned before, we are targeting the temporal domain. So we had used a flickering target, the slide that I showed before. So there is a target that flickers for a given temporal frequency. So the temporal frequency that we had used is a lower temporal frequency of 5 hertz and a 15 hertz temporal frequency, okay? So what I meant by this monocular input is that we show a target in the monitor. Okay, there are two backgrounds to it. One background that uses lower temporal frequency, and the other background that uses a higher temporal frequency. And the stimulus in the monitor shows up in 5 locations at the center and 5 degrees from the center, right? So it looks complex and it may sound complex, but it's a very simple task. So the target is a flickering target. As I said, for 15 hertz, it flickers in a very fast manner, and a 5 hertz is something that flickers a little slowly. So the 5 hertz target was shown at the center and 5 degrees from the center, and a 15 hertz target was shown again at the center and 5 degrees from the center. As you can see over here, this is the center and this is 5 degrees from the center. So 5 locations have been tested, and subject has a response box. As you can see over here, what the subject has to do is the response box geometrically simulates the monitor, right? The response box has a center button as well as the 4 perifoveal buttons. So whenever they see the target, they have to respond at the center or wherever the target had appeared. So this is a psychophysical method. So as the subject responds, the computer takes in the input, and the average of a given number of responses will be taken as a sensitivity level of that particular subject. Okay. So what we also did with respect to the monocular input is that, as I said, we tested 2 temporal frequencies, one that corresponds to a rod photoreceptor and the other corresponds to the cones photoreceptor. And we had optimized the other stimulus parameters that could possibly vary the function, as I mentioned before. We used 5 target sizes. Now, the reason for using 5 target sizes is basically The small target size, when you measure the monocular sensitivity, the sensitivity would be very poor because it's a very small target. And when you use a very large target, the sensitivity will be a little higher. So we use a 5 target sizes, starting from a smallest to a largest, to change the monocular input to find how the summation ratio varies, right? So we use these target sizes. This is the smallest, 7 minutes of arc, and 60 minutes of arc, which is the largest target. And we measure the right eye separately, left eye separately, and we measure their binocular sensitivity as well, right? So I'm going to quickly go through the results. Go through the results of what we did. This becomes very important because the temporal frequency that I mentioned, the 15 hertz and the 5 hertz are the 2 frequencies that we had used. And the luminance for 15 hertz is 24 candela, and for the smallest frequency that we had used is 0.5 candela. So this is the result that we got. I know this is a pretty busy slide, so I'm going to ignore the similar sort of the results that we got in the other locations. I'm going to center only the fovea for now, right? So over here, the x-axis is the target size, that is in arc minutes, starting from a smallest target size to a larger target size, as I mentioned before. And the FMT is the flicker modulation threshold, which means what is the threshold of the observer. So basically, if the thresholds are increasing, it means the performance is poor. So this is the inverse of sensitivity that we have. Higher the threshold value, poorer is the sensitivity. Lower the threshold value, higher is your sensitivity. Okay, it's a little difficult to understand, but let me know if you have any questions at the end of the presentation. So the different markers, the red and the black, denotes your monocular and binocular performance. Okay, so if you focus on the binocular markers and the monocular markers over here for easy interpretation, your monocular markers show a little higher thresholds than the binocular markers, which means for any given target size, binocularly, you are far better than the monocular performance. As I said before, the lower the threshold value, better is the performance. So binocularly, you perform better, right? This is what we saw in the data. Now comes the 15 hertz target. Okay, that's the previous one was for 5 hertz and this is for 15 hertz. Similarly, the target size smaller and larger, and the flicker modulation threshold increases. Again, if you see over here, binocularly, we are far better than the monocular performance. Now, this is something that is interesting because previously what we had found was for a range of temporal frequencies, we did find the change in the monocular and binocular. But when here what we targeted was 15 and 5 hertz for different target size. So depending on the target size also, there is a gradual decrease at the threshold, and binocularly, we are better. Now, this is more interesting than the previous data. This is a summation ratio that we've been talking about for the past 30-35 minutes. Now, the x-axis over here shows the target size and the y-axis the summation ratio. Since it's a ratio, it doesn't have a unit to it. So you know how we calculated the ratio. We use the monocular threshold, what we found in the previous result. We use this monocular threshold, divided that by the binocular thresholds, right? That's how we got the summation ratio. Now, if you follow the summation ratio, the dotted lines over here is equal to 1, right? You remember the values. When it is equal to 1, there is no change. When it is greater than 1, it means binocularly you're performing better. When it is less than 1, you are very poor binocularly. So there are a few data points that showed inhibition, that is binocularly they were poor, but monocularly they were better. And when it comes to both temporal frequency that we had used, both 15 hertz, 5 hertz and 15 hertz did not show any dependency in the target size. So summation ratio in general did not show any change in the values depending upon the monocular input. The summation ratios were totally independent of whatever the monocular inputs were. So I'm going to skip this slide. Yeah. So to summarize the first act, understanding what is the role of the monocular input, we did see that the differences were noticed both in monocular and binocular FMTs, binocular being better, and the smallest target size showed a larger difference, right? The 7 minutes of arc is the one that showed larger difference between the eye, and the summation ratios were quite independent regardless of what the target sizes were. So the second act is the interocular differences. That is the difference between the right eye and the left eye, right? So this again was done using the same setup, advanced vision and optometric test. So over here, what we did was, as I mentioned, that there is a difference between the eye. We sort of wanted to understand what if we create the difference, right? So the previous monocular input experiment, what we understood was these visually normal human subjects did shows a large difference, interocular difference, when we used a smaller target size, a spatial target. When we used, there was quite a bit of a difference. Now we wanted to induce that difference or disparity between the eye using a retinal illuminance as a factor. So what we did was we used a neutral density filter in front of one eye, which attenuates light, and the other eye is without the filter, so that one eye gets 100 candela per meter squared, and the other eye, the eye with the filter, gets a 25 candela per meter squared based on what intensity we use. So in this case, we induced the difference between the eye in terms of retinal illuminance, and then we measured the same using a 15 hertz target, right? The same center and the 5 locations, but now you have the difference between the eye. Okay, so this is what we did. I'll show what the protocol was. So we used 8 neutral density filters. So these filters come in different range, lower to higher intensity. Lower filters, transmits a lot of light, but high intensity filters cut down a lot of light. Okay, so the interocular difference that we measured was from 10% of a difference to 80% of a difference, right? Again, we measured their binocular and monocular flicker modulation thresholds separately as right eye and left eye, and then we measured their binocular input. For ease of understanding, each of the subject had filter in one eye. We measured the modulation threshold through that eye and the unfiltered eye. And once the unfiltered eye is closed, we measure again with the filter, and the same filter switched to the other eye, and then binocularly having the filter in front of one eye. This is how we measured. And I'm going to show 2 important results over here. One is when we have an overall change in the luminance. We saw the same in the previous slides. When the luminance changes, how the function changes, but that's for a range of temporal frequency. But I'm going to show you what happens for a particular temporal frequency when we change the overall luminance, right? So here is the retinal illuminance that is in Trollens, like how we saw before, a very small retinal illuminance to a very large retinal illuminance. And this is the sensitivity or threshold like the previous graphs. The different markers over here again shows the monocular FMT, monocular threshold, and the binocular threshold, right? So again, a similar trend that we notice, the binocular performance is a little better than the monocular performance. And when we compare the summation ratios, equal to 1 and less than 1 or greater than 1, the range that we see over here for the overall change in the luminance seems to be the same. So when I decrease or increase the luminance in both the eyes, similarly, there is no change in the summation ratio. Now, what will be more interesting is to find what happens when there is a difference between the eye, right? So the x-axis over here shows the Trollens from 815 Trollens to 186 Trollens. So this is in terms of the interocular differences that we had created. This is the monocular performance for the subjects. There were 13 subjects who were included. So for every retinal illuminance, what is the threshold value? As the retinal illuminance decreases, right, the threshold values are higher, if you notice this. And for a larger retinal illuminance, the thresholds are better. As I said, lower the value, better is the performance. And this is the unattenuated eye. So these are the retinal illuminance created, the range is created using different neutral density filters, and the unattenuated eye range is somewhere over here around 3 to 3.5% of FMT, right? So there is a clear difference when we use the filter and without the filter, the FMT levels. When we see the binocular performance of this, so this is their monocular performance like the previous graph. Their binocular performance again is far better than the monocular performance for all the intraocular differences that we had created. Now, the summation ratios over here is something that is very intriguing. The x-axis is the difference that we created from 10% to 80%, a very small difference between the eye to a very large difference, that is a high neutral density filter that we had used. And this is the summation ratio. So there were no instances where the summation ratio was less than 1. So summation ratios were all greater than one, meaning the visual system handled these differences binocularly better than the monocular performance, right? So whatever the intraocular differences, binocularly we are able to handle these differences. However, you see a small trend over there. Until here, there is sort of a flat curve that you see, and then beyond this percentage, you see a decline in the data points. Maybe this might be the cutoff for our visual system to handle the disparity, and beyond which greater than 40% of a difference, we sort of collapse the system and it does not perform binocularly better. So that's the inference that we had from the interocular difference perspective. So just to have an interim summary to this, there were a significant change that was noted beyond the 70% of the intraocular difference, that is greater than 560 tolens. Binocular FMT were lower than the monocular FMT across all the intraocular differences, and summation ratios were greater than 1 for all the differences that we had used, right? So to summarize these results from the temporal domain with a binocularity perspective is that at 1, we had the monocular threshold. We changed the monocular threshold using different target size. And what we ended up finding is the summation ratios still are independent regardless of what the target size that were used. They did not depend upon the monocular threshold or the change in the absolute monocular threshold. At 2, what we found was using the interocular differences, the visual system was more immune to the retinal illuminance changes up to some point, but beyond that, the visual system could not handle that disparity in terms of retinal illuminance. And the third one, what we have as an anecdotal evidence at present is that we had used a unilateral disease condition called as the branch retinal vein occlusion, where we wanted to study the same Act 1 and Act 2, but in a disease model. So as we all know, branch retinal vein occlusion is a retinal condition which is unilateral and it is a sectoral specific disease. So we wanted to compare or wanted to know more about area-specific changes in the threshold or the sensitivity, as well as the summation ratios. We did find very interesting data on that, but again, that is still anecdotal evidence when compared to the first and the second results that we have. So I would like to end the talk over here. All these work can never be complete without the support of my mentors, Shrikant Bharadwaj, Dr. Amit Rugvedi Hathivalgal from LV Prasad Eye Institute, Hyderabad, and the other mentors from City University of London, John Barber and Marisa. So all these guys have played a vital role in tuning my PhD, and I also would extend my thanks to Fakhruddin for giving me this pleasant opportunity to present in front of young people over here. So thank you, and I'm open for questions if there are any.
Thank you, Reena. Thank you so much for sharing the wonderful work you have been doing in your lab and taking us through what is all this about, because this is more of a vision science perspective, and I was happy to see that you also related to the clinical part of it, because that is really important as well. How are we going to apply into clinic when we have patients with conditions who are affected by monocular vision conditions? So if they are patient, like you gave an example of BRVO,
yeah,
where patients who have monocular condition causing diseases, right? So we really need to be informed about when we are seeing these patients into the clinic.
Right.
Well, to the attendees, if you have any questions, please feel free to put up on the chat. We would be taking some questions, and if there is any concerns or doubts, we will be happy to answer.
So she's asking, what are the temporal vision features in one-eyed person? Do they have some adaptation mechanism to it? Okay, that's a wonderful question actually, and most interesting question that we always wanted to have more evidence on, because as she mentioned, what is the feature that one-eyed person will have all for the past 40 minutes, I've been talking about, binocular performance and the advantages of binocular performance. But when it comes to one-eyed person, where there are no additional cues, unlike, a binocular creature. So with one eye, of course, and obviously, the functions, any function that you test, for instance, here I'm going to talk about the temporal perspective. So the temporal functions for one-eyed person will be low because there is just one input over there, right? And when you measure the summation ratio, one-eyed in the sense there are different types to it. So one-eyed person can have a very low threshold in one eye, and the other eye can have a very high threshold due to any pathology. And the other scenario is a completely one-eyed person. There's just a socket, and then the person is one-eyed due to several other reasons. The first scenario, the summation ratios would neither change or it would be stable. There wouldn't be any change in it. Whereas the other scenario, you cannot even compute the summation ratios because it's an absolute eye, right? So the adaptation perspective of this is that there is one of my colleague who is studying about the stereo acuity and in a real life basis in one-eyed people. What she also found was there are different monocular cues that kick in for all these patients, and of course there would be some sort of adaptation that would take place when it comes to cues itself. Okay, I'm not talking about they getting adapted to see better, but there are cues that would help them to get adapted to a particular parameter. Not all the parameters in the function is going to improve. There are only few parameters that individual could get adapted to. So taken together, one-eyed person in the two scenarios, the first scenario, there can be changes when we measure, but the summation ratios there would be no change, or there would be poor summation ratios in those subjects.
I see. Yeah. So yeah, it's $1 million question. A lot of research has to be done as well in that area, right? One-eyed, it's always a concern on how they can see well, and some of the times even they do better, right?
Yeah. That's right.
Great. And just to kind of wrap and summarize, while some questions might just pop in. So as a clinical optometrist, Reena, let's say we are into clinical practice, do you have any tips on how should we going about putting the research work you are doing to the clinical practice? Any key message you want to pass?
So one, you're asking about this particular temporal
finding. Yes.
Okay. So one, this is again far-fetched because this is more of basic research sort of a study. But however, I have a couple of instances where you can actually see these differences. So take in a pediatric clinic when you see children who are diagnosed with amblyopia, right? Yeah. So these amblyopic kids, what happens is, again, there is a difference between both the eye. One eye is the dominant eye, and the amblyopic eye is the one which is deficient in some functions. Say, for instance, spatial function, the visual acuity is reduced. So, for instance, the right eye, the dominant eye, right eye, has a 20/20 vision. And the left eye, the eye with amblyopia, has a vision of 20/60. Now, there is a difference in the spatial visual acuity that we measure. But when you measure the same child's temporal acuity, right? Not the temporal acuity, but the temporal aspects. If you bring the child to the lab and measure for a given temporal frequency, say 15 hertz you're measuring, the same child will show the same deficit as we see in the visual acuity. So it's not always that, the differences that occurs in amblyopic subjects or any amblyopia or suppression, a stereo blind child, whoever is there, they wouldn't show the deficits only to a spatial target, but those deficits could also be in the temporal domain. So in the clinic, if you see, the second point that I wanted to reiterate was always give importance to the binocular acuity as well, right? So monocularly, we always measure. We accrued one eye, we measure the right eye and left eye separately. But binocularly also becomes a critical factor, especially in people whose vision is not improving beyond 20/30 or 20/40 monocularly. So if you measure the same subjects or same children binocularly, they would try to perform better than their monocular performance. So in this way, you can actually compute the summation ratio by yourself in the clinic, saying, hey, this kid is performing better by this amount. That's how I see. So one is amblyopia, and the other one is, in general, if we give more weightage to a binocular performance, that would be good. And you will also be more curious to understand what exactly is that quantification telling us.
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, very important key take-home messages for the clinical optometrists who are here. So, anybody who is having these, amblyopia is just one of the many examples. You might just walk in a pediatric clinic, common, but a lot of other conditions where you can look by it. So, I think with that, we have taken questions which have popped up on the chat. And if there are any other questions, please feel free to write to us, and we can always connect to Reena and get her opinion and her expertise onto this topic.
Sure.
Thank you, Reena. Thank you so much for spending your time and sharing the expertise with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you again to you as well as the organizing committee for having me over here. Thank you so much.
Most welcome. We do have a session planned next weekend. Until then, take care, be safe, and hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Reena. Take care.